Good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon.
Sir, how are you?
I'm good.
Good.
Nice to see you.
Dr. Jadhav, may I introduce our illustrious panelist?
Hello.
The one with a lot of law books at his back is Mr. Sunil Gupta, senior advocate, Supreme Court of India, a very distinguished lawyer and a fighter for all purposes, in court, outside court. We have the headmaster of the Doon School
Voice is
also
breaking.
there. I'm sure you recognize him. He's a very, very young and a very bold headmaster.
I love that word. I love that word, young.
Dr. Jakpreet Singh. We also have Dr. Jadhav, Dr. Mohan Reddy with us. Dr. Mohan Reddy is a very great industrialist and a very good human being. I'm just wanting Madam Dipali to come on live. I think she's put her lovely photograph for all of us to see. We'll wait for Dr. Dipali. Mr. Om Pathak is there. Mr. Om Pathak should be joining us soon. So, ma'am, do we begin if it's okay?
Yes, we can begin now. Everybody has joined. Mr. Pathak is awaited, but in the meantime, we can start.
I'm here.
Good evening, Mr. Pathak. Thank you for joining.
Good evening.
Hello, Dipali. Dr. Dipali, how are you? Dr. Dipali, you're still on mute. We can't hear you, Dr. Dipali.
We have given her the panelist rights. Probably there is some problem with her.
Okay. Let me welcome Dr. Jadhav and the panelists for today's discussion on the education system in India, as well as the future of Indian education system. And we would also be focusing a lot on the relevance of the national education policy. So this program, this webinar has been organized by the Forum for Promotion of Quality Education. These are schools which are like-minded schools. They've all got together to create a great platform for education in this country. The schools are Shriram School, Vasant Valley, Mothers International, Birla Schools, the Salvan Schools, Tagore International, St. Mark's Senior Secondary School, Nirmal Bhartiya, and Delhi Public School Society, Ghaziabad. We have amongst us some great luminaries, and I am sure none of them need an introduction, but it would be most appropriate for me to give a brief introduction. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Narendra Jadhav, who is a member of Parliament of Rajya Sabha, nominated by the President of India. Dr. Jadhav, you're most welcome to the webinar. Dr. Jadhav is an economist, he is an educationist, he is into academics, he's an administrator, he's an author in English, Marathi, and Hindi. Over and above all his credentials, I must say that he's a great human being, down to earth, and an upright person, and a very straightforward person.
Thank you.
Dr. Jadhav is holding a PhD in economics from Indiana University. He has an outstanding professional career spanning over 4 decades in public service. Some of the distinguished positions held by him are being member of the Planning Commission, Vice Chancellor of Pune University, Advisor, International Monetary Fund, and Chief Economist, Reserve Bank of India. Dr. Jadhav recently also served as the Chairman Advisory Committee on RBI. Dr. Jadhav, that's absolutely awesome, and thank you so much for joining us. And there's something interesting I must share with the panelists as well as the audience out here. He's a prolific writer, and he's written in 3 languages, Marathi, English, and Hindi. He has written and edited 41 books. There are 300 research papers and articles to his credit. Thank you, Dr. Jadhav, once again.
Thank you.
We also have a very interesting industrialist, a philanthropist by heart, and that's Dr. Mohan Reddy, who served as the chairman of NASSCOM from 2015 to 16 and was a member of its executive council since 2003. He served as the chairman of CII, Southern Region, and is currently the co-chair of its National Education Council. He is also founding director of T-Hub, the largest startup incubation center in the country. Dr. Mohan acts as the honorary counsel for the Federal Republic of Germany for the states of Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, and also serves on board of various industrialists in international companies. Dr. Mohan also took up several leadership positions to promote higher education in the country, and he is currently the chairman of Board of Governors of IIT Hyderabad. Dr. Mohan Reddy, I also see that you are making a huge contribution towards philanthropy. You have adopted government schools and to provide support to 18,500 children in 28 government schools. You are promoting digital literacy through your company. Dr. Mohan Reddy, thank you so much for being with us. And you also hold a postgraduate degree from IIT Kanpur and University of Michigan, USA. You are also a recipient of the honorary doctorate from JNTU Hyderabad, as well as Andhra University. I can actually go on with the credentials of Dr. Mohan Reddy, but I think he's giving me an indication that I must stop as far as he's concerned. Well, besides the members from the education fraternity, we have a very eminent lawyer from the Supreme Court of India. As a matter of fact, let me put it in simple terms. The Delhi schools, as well as the schools in India, call him the Messiah of schools because he has been taking up the cases of school and higher education in the High Court and Supreme Court. And I must say that he has come up with all flying colors. Whether it was the admission policy or the fee regulations, he has fought tooth and nail to preserve and protect the autonomy of the private schools. Mr. Sunil Gupta, senior advocate, incidentally, law was not his first choice. He wanted to go to Bombay, but then his father, the famous Mr. S.C. Gupta, a senior advocate, who was also the Advocate General of the state of UP for almost about 20 years. His father insisted that he should take up the legal profession. And we have with us Mr. Sunil Gupta, a very great legal luminary. Like I said, he is a fighter in court and outside court also. Mr. Sunil Gupta, thank you so much for joining us. A great educationist by heart and very passionate person towards education is Mr. Om Pathak. He is the founder and chairman of the Delhi Public School Society, Ghaziabad, which runs 7 schools in North India and is also the founder chairman of Silakwi International School in Dehradun. Mr. Pathak has been in the field of education for more than about 40 years. He was also on the board of IMT, Institute of Management Technology, one of the top management schools in India. Teacher City was his initiative where he wanted to train teachers. He held a lot of conferences for supporting the teacher community. Mr. Om Pathak, thank you so much for being with us. And I'm sure you're going to take this web conference in a very interesting way forward. A very interesting person we have from the field of higher education, and that is Dr. Dipali Singhi. But if I continue with the credentials of Dipali Singhi, believe me, my dear panelists, I would possibly be taking 2 hours. But I have, with her permission, precisely confined it to just about 120 seconds. She presently holds the post of Principal J.D. Birla Institute in Kolkata. She did a PhD from the Faculty Council of Science, Department of Chemistry. She did a schooling from Calcutta from the Ashoka Hall Girls' School. She's been a professor having 25 years of experience. She's a visiting faculty at the Institute of Jute Technology in Calcutta. She has membership of 23 professional bodies and societies. She has attended and she has won 24 international and national awards. And that's a lot for such a young person. She has 18 publications to her credit. And Dr. Dipali, thank you so much for being with us. And I'm sure you are going to take up the cause for higher education, which is, as a matter of fact, suffering much more than the school education in this country. With Dr. Dipali, we have a very interesting person from school education, that is Mrs. Anu Monga. Anuji started a career at early years as a teacher in nursery school in New Delhi. She became the vice chair of the school board and the Parents Teacher Association at the British School. She simultaneously took charge of the Delhi International Football League, which initially only included a handful of schools, and that also from embassies. Anu moved to work at India's first IB school, that is the Kodaikanal International School. In 2002, Anu received the challenging task of transforming the Bangalore International School. She was also the first Indian to be offered a place in the program at the KCT College, Columbia University, and the first Indian to be induced into the International Education Hall of Fame. Mrs. Anu Mongia, welcome to the board. And I'm sure with your experience in IB curriculum and international schools, you'll be able to give a precise picture about how NEP challenges IB. Thank you so much, Mrs. Anu Mongia. An interesting educationist by heart. Why I say that is because he left his family business, which runs a chain of hotels in Ajmer and Pushkar. There's Dr. Jagpreet Singh, who is presently the headmaster of the prestigious Doon School at Dehradun. Dr. Jagpreet had a tenure at Mayo College, and also thereafter he moved to the Punjab Public School Nava as a headmaster for nearly 10 years and brought laurels to the school. He is the honorary secretary and the sports director of the IPSC schools. Dr. Jagpreet Singh, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The moderation is going to be done by Mrs. Seema Malik. She's the principal of one of the eminent schools of Delhi. She has been a principal and an educationist in various schools in Ludhiana, Bulandshahr, UP, as well as Delhi. To her, she has a credit of attending more than 25 international seminars and conferences. So, Mrs. Seema Malik, it's on to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you. Mrs. Malik, you're on mute. Mrs. Malik, you're on mute. Sorry.
Thank you so much for everybody who's joined, and thanks, Mr. Salwan, for everybody's introduction. And I'm sure that much more could have been said than it has been for the paucity of time we have. But that doesn't take away the sheen from the glorious panel that we have. So I begin with Dr. Jadhav, who wrote an absolutely illustrious book on the cause of education, how it has progressed over the decades, and how it is going to shape the world, or at least our country from now on, with special reference to the NEP. And Dr. Jadhav, in his introduction, has so rightly said that if there is one thing which can bring socio-economic justice to the country, that is education. It goes without saying. It has taken him 5 years of writing, in spite of the fact that he suffered a personal setback, but that didn't deter him from writing this absolutely beautiful book. And I would like to tell the audience here that what I've taken from the book and what I'm going to ask him is about the education policy and the future and the way ahead. But I might add that terms like the gross enrollment ratio, the national enrollment ratio, the demographic dividend of the country, everything has been so well explained by Dr. Jadhav, who has a number of books to his credit. So Dr. Jadhav, the first thing that I would like to begin by asking you is that tell us something about the national education policy. What has been the foundation stone on which it has been built after successive commissions of education? And where does it take us from now on? All yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Seemaji, for a very glorious introduction, very generous introduction. And I want to thank all of you for having organized this panel discussion with glorious panel, as you mentioned. Very quickly, I'm going to talk about my book that is the basis of this discussion. This is the book, by the way. This is the book that has just recently come out. This is the first book on National Education Policy 2020. The future of the Indian education system, how relevant is the National Education Policy 2020? That is the title of the book. And this is the book which puts together the current status and future of education in India. And it talks about, in that context, it talks about what difference the National Education Policy recently announced 2020 is going to make. So very brief capsule I will give on this book. First thing to note is that after a long gap of 34 years, a new national education policy has come up, and this was announced on 29 July 2020. And this policy, new national education policy, is actually a culmination of a long drawn process and is primarily it is built on the Herculean effort of the so-called Kasturirangan report. So let me begin by talking briefly about the Kasturirangan report, and then I'll come to the policy proper. Because the basis of the new national education policy is primarily the Kasturirangan report. So we must understand, and that's a very long report, 450 pages of magazine size. As compared to that, the national education policy itself is only a 60-page slick, very precise document. So first, let me talk about the Kasturirangan report. On the whole, I'm going to make some very broad observations. There are 2-3 things which stand out positively about this report. First of all, Kasturirangan report is a monumental report. The sheer enormity of the work and effort that has gone into preparation of this document is indeed awe-inspiring. First. Second positive thing is that this report actually aims at evolving India-centric education system, emphasizing India's rich cultural advantage and values. And third one is that Kasturirangan report, on positive side, it attempts to build an equitable and vibrant knowledge society. And this is being done for universal and equitable access to a broad-based, high-quality education. That said, on the other hand, there are major shortcomings of the report. I will quickly mention that and move on to the national education policy. The first objection that I have about the Kasturirangan report is that this report does not have any structured analytical foundation, nor does it put a whole lot of statistical information buttressing its information or buttressing its recommendations. Now, that's a major shortcoming. The second shortcoming that I see is that the Kasturirangan report sets out several time-bound quantitative targets, such as universal participation in school education by the year 2030, achieving GER, the gross enrollment ratio of 50% by the year 2035, and so on. However, these objectives are very good, very novel, but there are no clear-cut objective roadmaps to lead to achievement of these objectives. In absence of a concrete action programs to go with all these quantitative objectives, the report to an extent is reduced to nothing more than a lofty intentions on part of the government. Now, that is what I would like to say about the Kasturirangan report. Now, coming to the National Education Policy 2020, we need to address 3 issues. One, what is entirely new in the National Education Policy, which was not there in Kasturirangan report. Secondly, what important proposals of the Kasturirangan report have been either deleted or modified. And the third one, what is still missing in the National Education Policy. Very quickly, I want to respond to these 3 questions. First of all, new proposals, those proposals which are entirely new, which appear in the National Education Policy 2020. First, mother tongue as a medium of instruction. Extremely important provision that has been added. Second, National Assessment Center. This was not there in the Kasturirangan report, and that has been added in the National Education Policy. Very, very worthwhile. Third one, multidisciplinary higher educational institutions with multiple exit options and academic bank of credit. Wonderful addition that has been made anew in the National Education Policy. Particularly, the artificial distinction between the arts, science, and commerce goes away once for all, and and the credits earned by the students are digitally stored in the academic bank of credit, and every institution will be a multidisciplinary higher educational institution. These are all very, very good proposals, very new additions to the Kasturirangan report. That's the first part. Second part is, what are the major proposals of Kasturirangan report which have been modified or eliminated by the national education policy? Here there are 2-3 points to make. First, about the RTE Act, Right to Education Act. Kasturirangan report surreptitiously tried to dilute the RTE provision, RTE Act provision 12A1, and that deletion is omitted by the national education policy, which means that there would not be an adverse review. The RTE has been implemented for the last 10 years, from 1st April 2010, but in 10 years, it has not been effectively implemented, and further diluting it would have been a retrograde step. Fortunately, the new education policy, National Education Policy 2020, does not talk about the revision in the name of relaxing the Right to Education Act.
That's a glaring error. That's a glaring error in everybody's opinion, that how it is completely missed out. And sir, could I also bring something here?
I need 2 minutes more to finish.
Sure.
Then I'll come back
Yes.
to you. So first is the RTE Act, then second is National Education Commission. The Kasturirangan report had recommended a National Education Commission at the central level, which has been retained by the National Education Policy. However, Kasturirangan Committee had also recommended that there should be state-level education commission. Now that has been modified, and there is no scope, no role for statewide education commissions in the national education policy. The education departments have been given that role, and a little bit greater role in the CABE, that is the Central Advisory Board on Education. The third one, a very important one, as far as the funding of education is concerned, Kasturirangan report had talked not only about moving to the ever elusive target of 6% of public expenditure on education, they had also recommended that public expenditure on education as the ratio of total education, not as the GDP, as the ratio of total education, total expenditure should be increased from 10% to 20%. Now that has been conveniently dropped in the national education policy, and I think that is a retrograde step, because we need to move rapidly towards 6% of GDP equivalent expenditure on education. Now, final part is what is still missing in the national education policy. Two things I would like to mention here and stop. First is that out of school children,
Yes.
According to the 2011 census, the out of school children are as large as 80 million. And out of these 80 million out of school children, 44 million children have never ever gone to school. And the remaining 36 million are dropouts. Now, how to get them on board? It does not give any plan of action. And the second and the last point here is that the transition to education 4.0. Everything is moving industrial revolution from 1, 2, 3, and now industrial revolution 4.0. Education is needed to move from earlier level to an entirely new level of education 4.0. That doesn't seem to be happening. So in sum, I feel that the new education policy 2020 has a great potential to be a critical turning point and a massive game changer, provided that a detailed time-bound program of action is prepared. Governments make concerted efforts to move towards the 6% of GDP equivalent of expenditure, and private sector responds positively, and this is very important for you. Private sector responds positively to light but tight regulations and makes honest disclosures on all aspects of their educational operations. And central and state governments work together in tandem, keeping aside all the party policies or party lines for meticulous implementation. Devil is in the detail, and we need to implement this great document, great development in most effective manner, because our future depends on it, literally.
Literally.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that is exactly where the book ends, and ends so well. But I have some issue here about two matters in particular. And one of those you mentioned already, and that is the light but tight regulations. So I have a question here to Mr. Gupta, that what do you say about the autonomy issue? The schools are being constricted, the higher education institutes are being constricted by so many regulations. And secondly, sir, we'd like to know from you the language formula, which is being imposed once again by the new education policy. Where does it stand as far as the legal rights of an individual and the state are concerned? Mr. Sunil Gupta.
He's on mute. Sir, you're on mute. Mr. Gupta, you're on mute.
Please unmute yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Malik. It's been really wonderful listening to our main speaker, Mr. Jadhav. And of course, I must confess, I have not had the pleasure of having gone through the book, but I'm sure it'll be a very, very desirable exercise for me, at least, to do that. And that'll be quite early in the day that I will do this. I find that largely the focus of the book and the author was on the foundation of the national education policy, as he was telling us about the Kasturi Rangan report, and the extent to which the policy has agreed with the report and has perhaps also disagreed or digressed from it. There are 2 points which, in particular, Dr. Jadhav has mentioned, where I would beg to disagree, and I have a slightly different point of view with regard to the policy. I must say that I was in the middle of educationists. I thought so many more people, the educationists, will speak first, and I must and should have come only much later. But for a person to have a critical view, and that to a lawyer, it's too early for me to start criticizing the policy, which should be very attractive for most of you. But as per my habit, I cannot but find holes or loopholes in the policy. And I find that in particular, I'm disappointed by the fact that very little attention has been paid by the framers of the policy to the attending legal or constitutional values, which should have actually been kept in mind before making any recommendations or before suggesting any of those plans or ideas which are contained in this charter, the policy that we are talking about. As you will appreciate, the policy is nothing but it's a manifesto for various kinds of pedagogical and academic reforms. And to bring in these reforms, it is only going to be possible if you have the suitable legislative and administrative measures in place. Now, all this can only be implemented if, in the first place, all of these legislative or administrative reforms and measures are beyond the pale of challenge in courts and beyond the scope of any controversy or a doubt with regard to the constitutional, legal, fundamental rights of people, of the citizens, of schools, of parents. So on the 2 points that Dr. Jadhav has just made, namely, he mentioned, of course, just before he is closed, the regime of light but tight regulation, as opposed to the celebrated concept of autonomy that we know of, at least in the private unaided sector, where the schools or the institutions do not take any financial aid from the state or the governments. And actually, ideally, on principle, even any educational institution, whether it's government or public for that matter, should have that modicum of autonomy. And I don't know to what extent, because my previous speaker, Dr. Jadhav, also said the devil lies in the detail. So I will just now give you a comparison from the details of the policy with some principles that our Supreme Court of India has laid down in this regard in the private sector, the private education sector, as regards autonomy, and how far this policy, you will see how far it actually conforms or deviates from from those principles. So there is very little chance that if you really implement this policy the way it has been drafted and crafted, these reforms will even take off. If I can just request Madam Moderator to Ms. Malik to just screen share that little comparison that I have already passed on to her. If you can come to the first page, see, and I'm just going to exactly take you to the lines and the language of the Supreme Court so that this is authentic as it can get. And I'm comparing before you the extracts or the basic principles which have been actually laid down for this century. At the beginning of this century, you can see that there's the judgment called the TMA Pai versus State of Karnataka 2002 8 SCC. And we have to compare this with some of the tenets in the policy. Now, I'm just going to read out and explain at times to you what this is all about. Now, an 11-judge bench, that's the importance of this matter. There were 11 judges of the Supreme Court who decided this case and disapproved the nationalization of education and upheld the fundamental right to occupation and autonomy of private unaided institutions under the Constitution of India. So if you see on the left hand, there are certain paragraphs from which I have extracted the principles. And the key word is that there should be autonomy and actually no regulation for that matter. And I'm just going to read now. The essence of a private educational institution is the autonomy. There necessarily has to be a difference in the administration of private unaided institutions and the government aided institutions. We'll just compare this with the policy on the other hand. Let me just read through this column first. Whereas in the latter case, that is government institutions, the government will have greater say in the administration, including admissions and fixing of fees. In the case of private unaided institutions, maximum autonomy has to be with the private unaided institutions. Then you see, bureaucratic or governmental interference in the administration of such an institution will undermine its independence. Please come to the second page. Yes, para 56 of that judgment. One cannot lose sight of the fact that providing good amenities to the students in the form of competent teaching faculty and other infrastructure costs money. One also cannot lose sight of the fact that we live in a competitive world today. Economic forces have a role to play. That is, market forces will have a role to play in this. The decision on the fee to be charged must necessarily be left to the private educational institution. In the case of unaided private schools, maximum autonomy has to be with the management. Autonomy and non-regulation will ensure that more such institutions are established. I wanted to read this line to you from the Supreme Court's own judgment so that all of you really believe me when I tell you that non-regulation is the rule propounded by the highest court for the land in this century. Appropriate machinery can be devised by the state or university to ensure that no capitation fee is charged and there is no profiteering, that is to say by any private person. So no commercialization, and that's the only mechanism which is permitted for the purposes of regulating fee, etc. It is well established that all over the world that those who seek professional education must pay for it. Now please come to the right side of the column and you see some extracts from the basic paragraphs on these matters in the national education policy. If we were to implement this, this will run completely in the teeth of the observations and the decision that I have just now read. Now, the NEP 2020 regime of light but tight regulation. Now you see for schools, there has been far too much asymmetry between the regulatory approaches to public and private schools. So that is the grievance with which the policy begins to tell you about this matter. They find that it is asymmetrical and we must bring these two, public and private schools, at par. And what do? They say in 8.5, states and union territories will set up the State School Standards Authority, transparent public self-disclosure of all the basic regulatory information will be used extensively for public oversight, not just the government oversight, public oversight and accountability. We are talking of the private sector schools also. Any complaints or grievances from stakeholders or others, that means any other person, just a moment, arising out of the information placed in the public domain shall be adjudicated by the authority that I just now mentioned. So now every private unaided school will have to open a legal department and fight these cases and adjudications in the authority and the departments. And anybody, any other person also in the public can bring this litigation and complain before them. And public and private schools will be assessed and accredited on the same criteria. They make no bones about it. They are prepared to go completely contrary to the principle laid down by the Supreme Court, while protecting parents and communities from arbitrary increases in tuition fee. All the schools will be held to similar standards, and the very same pattern, the similar standards for all schools, whether public or private, same pattern has been followed also for the higher education institutions. We have the same language virtually repeated in paragraphs 18.3 and the next one. You see, all of this is very, very similar to what I've just now read. So in other words, you find that this aspect has been not only completely, the simple legal constitutional principles have not only been ignored and avoided, but they have been actually, in my humble opinion, they have been flouted. Then we come to the mother tongue, the language issue.
If I can intervene here, Mr. Gupta, we
Yes.
shall take up the language issue
Okay.
a little later, because I'd like Mr. Sushil Salwan has a question here,
Yes.
which he would like to address to Dr. Mohan Reddy. Mr. Salwan, please.
Dr. Reddy,
Yes.
Dr. Reddy, you just heard what Mr. Sunil Gupta said, that private institutions are primarily being strangulated. While we are all very keenly awaiting for this policy to get implemented, and everyone is looking forward to see the wisdom of the policy and the sort of effort which has gone in. So with all these innovations which have been propounded by Mr. Sunil Gupta, which have been culled out from the policy, do you feel a person, the industry, like you or Mr. Om Pathak would ever like to further invest in school education or higher education?
The answer is yes, we will continue to invest. We want to definitely support the society. Therefore, I think one thing we all have to remember is the cardinal principle with which the education system has been built in this country is that education is a non-profit. Well, if you want to question that, challenge that, I'm sure there are eminent advocates like Mr. Sunil Gupta. There are several more people who can definitely challenge that. But in my opinion, that's the tenet of this constitution of this country. We will not have education for profit. If we allow the private sector to do whatever they like is what I'm using a very general statement. I am very scared at this point of time that it probably will lead into more amount of chaos, more than what it is at this point of time. If you say market dynamics will apply, I think it will probably be too late in the day to recognize that we already have lost our game. So therefore, I think given what the history has been, you got to take into account what's past like. Past, we did have some frameworks with which we were operating. I think what the government is doing right now, and I firmly believe in that, is that giving certain amount of ability for organizations to work within the framework with certain amount of flexibility. A good example I have is where I work, especially in higher education. So far, the IITs or NIITs and NICERs and so on and so forth, all had money coming from the government. They're now saying, no, there is a new institution called HEFA that got created, Higher Education Funding Agency, where they have to take that loan. It's a bank, actually. I think Canada Bank is the nodal agency at this point of time. So the result is, I think sum total the story I'm saying at this point of time is there's history. We can't all of a sudden change the policy. The Constitution, at least in my understanding, provides that education was free. Not education is free. Education is not profit. So therefore, we have to work within that framework.
So, Dr. Reddy, as I understand, you are expecting basically either the industry or philanthropic people like you to come forward and support the education sector in this country. Am I right?
Yes. And there are some people who think they're very passionate about education. Like, not necessarily from people like you. I'm sure you have supported the education in a big way right now. So not necessarily, I don't know, pardon me if I make a mistake, but you don't run an industry at this point of time. It's basically your passion towards education. People have gone ahead and did it. I think that they can definitely do so long as they have the passion for it. So not necessarily it is the government or it is the philanthropy, but there are also a third group of people who are passionate about the society who can definitely support it.
So let's have the view of Mr. Om Pathak, who feels that education should be treated as an industry for the purposes of growth and development, and also that the education sector should not be strangulated by so much of close governance by the government. They should be allowed to generate funds for themselves to move ahead. Mr. Om Pathak, what are your views on this particular aspect? I don't know whether he's there. Mr. Om Pathak, you are on mute.
Thank you. I said my premise and my prism of looking at the whole thing is somewhat different. Now, I look at it from the student's point of view. What is it that they are getting? What is it that they need? We're not just looking at the garnishings of the policy, but I am looking at the end result. What does it produce for the child? Both who are out of the school must be brought into the school system, and those who are in the school already, they must be prepared for life. The question is that the new education policy should have been so formulated that it should actually prepare every young kid for the life ahead. That means equip them with the skills and the competences much beyond the knowledge and understanding for what that they may actually apply in the workplaces. Now, see, unfortunately, that has not been addressed. My take is that even the policy of 1986 was just as good. At the time that it came out, it spoke of the same laudatory words. Dr. Jadhav very beautifully brought out and put the whole thing in context. There was nothing wrong with that policy, but the question is, was it implemented? 73 years down the line of independence, how long will we go on clubbing Macaulay for what we haven't done? In 73 years, we haven't yet made an impact. Today, you just don't have skilled people. You have degree holders, but grossly unemployable. So I have to look at it from the standpoint of the student. What is it that they need and what is it that they are getting? Problem is not just our budgets. You make it 6% or 16%. The huge problem, because I've been a part of the government and I've seen it happen there, the very big question is about governance. Political governance and the administrative governance. And we sadly lack the will and the skills to be able to do it. Even where you have budgets, you haven't been able to do it. And quite unfortunately, you're talking of the private independent schools, the government which has failed to drive its own schools and produce their own results. I mean, you look at the state boards, you have 42% pass, 57% pass, somewhere they even have 80% pass. But the same very people who cannot run the government schools are today sitting on the private independent performing schools and telling them how to destroy their schools. That unfortunately doesn't bide well for the system. You have any policy, I think this policy is just as good. I have no serious issues with the policy, except that what Mr. Sunil Gupta brought out beautifully, it cuts at the very root of autonomy. I mean, how can you have investments? I was interacting with the government of UP, and do you know that the government of UP, and of course several other governments have the same sort of a dilemma, they don't have the money for capital expense for setting up high schools and higher secondary schools. They don't really have the operating budgets to be able to support the schools. So, where on earth are we going to get schools to educate our children? You can't run the government schools, you will not allow the private schools to function. Where will our children go? That worries me. That's one part.
Pathak, Mr. Pathak, what you're talking about, that the out of school children that Dr. Jadhav talks about, as well as the autonomy issue that Mr. Sunil Gupta has said, so it has impacted all the schools which are in the private sector. And what you were saying, that the skill gap that we're finding now is actually a ramification of all these, the problems that are very deeply embedded in our system of education. So are you looking forward to any change in the system of private education where you come from?
You see, education for all is the primary responsibility of the government. We not only pay taxes, we also pay education cess. But
Absolutely.
why is then the government, through the route of Article 21A, imposing that on the private schools to allow 25% of the seats to the weaker section? I am all for them. They have a place in our society and we must provide for that. But the point is, who will?
Yeah.
Who will? Now, after having brought in the 21A and having made it mandatory as per the RTE, the state governments are not even disclosing the actual expenditure per child in the state. They are coming out with false figures, and they're quite willing to sort of reimburse to the extent of 3,000 rupees a year. Is that the money that the state government is spending per child? No. They are not even sharing the extent of true expenses that the state actually spends on the child. So states seem to be in a very exploitative role. They are throttling the growth of the independent private schools, or not only the growth. My concern is even the private schools, the existing private schools may begin to suffer. Take the case of Delhi. You simply don't have new schools coming up.
Yeah.
There are issues around land prices. There are issues about the Delhi Education Act, which is very archaic. It should have been dumped a long time ago. Yet, the kind of cases that schools have to fight in Delhi, I really wonder, are they spending time in the classrooms or are they spending time in the courtrooms?
That's a major grudge. Yes.
They, for every little thing, you have to be there at the door of the court, knocking there, saying, I want relief. So
can I, Mr. Pathak, here bring in Dr. Dipali Singhi after discussing the school sector? Dr. Singhi, what do you think about the autonomy issues vis-a-vis the higher education institutes? And do you find any hope in the kind of research culture that is sadly missing from our higher education institutes to now come in with the government's many steps which have been taken, at least which have been announced in the NEP 2020? So what is your take on that?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
we can.
Yeah.
Yeah, your video is not, I think, working.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, I just switched. Yeah. Thank you for this interesting interactive session. I was so engrossed with what the speakers were saying as making my mental notes of some new information that's just come up. In terms of the higher education sector, I do agree that the autonomy will, if not given, whether it is a private organization or a government aided one, autonomy is very important, especially at the level of higher education, because otherwise innovation is going to be stifled. And if innovation doesn't happen, there is no education in terms of the higher levels, because higher education stands on this important pillar of innovation. We've got to innovate regularly to keep up with the changing trends. And if that doesn't really happen, there is no education. So with the current scenario, having so many issues with the private organizations vis-a-vis the government organizations, I personally feel, and I am sure there are facts available if we care to read about it, there are going to be a lot of organizations, however philanthropic mind they have, they're going to drop out because, as we just heard my previous speaker talking about the operating costs, it's going to become very challenging for such institutions to survive, especially when there is so much happening every day and so many changes happening every day. To keep up with the infrastructure, to keep up with the teacher training, it's going to become near impossible. So for institutes of learning, whether higher or at the primary sector, it is very important that they are given the freedom and autonomy to innovate. That's something very important. And it also goes along with this that research for institutes of higher learning becomes very imperative, because if you've got to keep up with the changing trends, research has to go on. And we all know that the funding that our government spends on research is almost negligible.
Very
And if you're going to compare it with the most developing countries, it's like something which is, not acceptable.
disappointing.
And especially since we are bringing in the private sector here, it is, the unaided institutions, even if they are covered under certain sectors of the UGC, for example, my own college, even if you're covered under 2F and 12G, you do not get the central funds. But the regulations come in irrespective of whether you've got the funds from the government or not. The funding on research is getting restricted only to certain institutes of higher learning. And in a country like ours, which is so vast and where we have more than 40,000 institutes of higher learning and about 361 universities, which, where there is lack of proper infrastructure, there is lack of proper teachers. The training of teachers is almost, absent in the country. These kind of, when you have these kind of situations in the country,
as you mentioned
it's
about,
going to become very difficult to carry on.
we'll just fix up your audio in a little while. I would like to ask Dr. Anuradha Munga here that the kind of schooling that she specializes in, the International Baccalaureate and the IGCSE. So, Dr. Munga, what do you say about the complete either missing of the teacher training initiatives that should be taken for bringing in quality education at school level? What is your view on that? Because neither teacher training has been given enough importance, and nor has it talked about the kind of pedagogy that we should be using in our schools. So what do you think about it?
Yes, it's very important. I think it should be one of the most important things in the school. And if you're talking about international schools, or are you talking about?
I'm talking from the international school perspective, the international curriculum perspective.
So what, I hate to say it, but what we have done is that teachers who have done this, B.Ed from here, it needs a lot of work. I mean, these are all talk and chalk teachers. We need to work with them to deliver pedagogy. So sometimes when I used to do training.
So your audio is not working, Dr. Munga, properly.
Is it okay now?
Yes, a little better.
Okay. So I used to work a lot with my teachers. And also what happens is when these teachers go out for training, and I'm sure you all send your teachers to training, it's not right to tell them when they come back, just show what you've learned. You have to see it in their practices. Because many schools ask their teachers to what they've learned. And we know some of these teachers, when they go out, they go for shopping and do all kinds of things. But I see it in the training when I watch them for 6 months, what they have learned and what they've delivered to their students.
So that's about the IB, IB perspective. But even otherwise, don't you think, Dr. Munga, and along with you, all the educationists who are here, that at the end of the day, what matters in the classroom is the actual result of all policies that we are talking about. And
Yeah.
for that, work is to be done through teacher training. So could I bring in Dr. Jakpreet Singh here, who would like to tell us perhaps about the boarding school perspective now, just as Mrs. Monga has spoken about the international curriculum. So Dr. Jakpreet Singh, what do you think about the complete missing of the pedagogical tools to be used, and how are they going to impact the boarding school culture, structure, and routines through these new policy, new measures which have been mentioned in the NEP?
Thank you, Ms. Malik, for getting me onto the panel. And I would really like to thank Mr. Sushil Salwan for having me here. But first of all, let me thank Dr. Jadhav for setting such a wonderful pace and giving us a platform to actually deliberate further. Very well elaborated. And I think, Dr. Jadhav, quite a few intriguing points have come out from your talk, which I've noted, which I did not really address earlier. Thank you for getting that on the floor. I would like to second Mr. Om Pathak here. He understands very clearly what education is. And I agree with him that our education has to be child-centric. We are having a tug of war at this moment with a policy which is still not taken a final shape. We are deliberating. We are looking into a policy which I think, according to me, is a very progressive and a very, very consolidated policy which has been out. Yes, whenever something new comes, there will be loopholes. I've been a boy who have been raised all the way in a residential school. 35 years I've spent all my life in residential schools. So I would be able to give a little bit of insight on all public schools, particularly I'm talking in residential point of view. How will it be impacted? First of all, we must understand a difference between a day school, a day come boarding school, and a complete boarding school. Now, in a day school, a child refers to a few hours where he takes education, enhances his skills, and goes back home where he has another set of people to enhance and to support. In day-come boarding, there are two laws in one land where certain children have an opportunity to go back home and exercise some skills, where others are refrained and are in a parameter which is designed by the school. But a complete residential school has a different dynamics altogether. Now, in this point of view, we are very concerned on a couple of points which I'll quickly elaborate. Number one, apart from pedagogy has to be similar in all the schools. The pedagogical styles, which now NEP is talking about, is a very high skill enhancement. And you have seen the improvised teacher training programs and coming up of principles where they have said 50 hours annually a principal has to spend now in the training program. It's wonderful. It's very good the way it is drafted. But my question is, in a residential school, what happens to pastoral care? That is the prime area. After 1:30 in a boarding school, I would say 20% learning is in the classroom, 80% is after the classrooms. When a child is on the playfield, in all this, what I'm missing out, whether I've not understood, I will request Mr. Jadhav or anyone, Mr. Gupta, maybe would be getting to us. We have talked about everything, but we have not talked about anything much about disabilities, the special needs children. We need to address that very carefully. They are the people who are equal members of the society, and of course, we need to address to them. Number two, very important is, we have talked about proposed language. Now, this language, what has been introduced in NEP, is my point of concern. Some schools start from early foundational years. Some start from primary years. Like a school which starts from class 4. And the guidelines are very clear. My only concern is from 3 to class 5, which stands as a preparatory education, and from class 6 to 8, which goes into middle. What happens if a school starts from class 4? They've already done class 3 in another school. They're coming with different proficiency of language. How will that school run a language? My only thing is that education is a concurrent subject. I only hope that we are given an elbow space where at least we have that freedom that we can design our own curriculums. We can design our own language proficiencies. We cannot cater to all the languages. If a child is done Kannada and coming to now to a different state public school, at least the government should have given us that much of elbow space that you can design your own languages. He may not able to continue with Kannada coming to Uttarakhand or coming to Rajasthan or coming to Assam. My only one point is this. Another point is the entry point. If
I can intervene here before you go on further, that this language issue will be taken up again by Mr. Sunil Gupta. He has done some work based on his legal perspective, and probably that will set all of us very clearly on the path of understanding that what is the kind of language matter that is thrown into the NEP, and what do we understand out of it, and what the public at large understands. So we'll come to it later, but please continue with your second point.
Another point which NEP is talking, and I really appreciate, and I give my hats off to that, is fixing a minimum student-teacher ratio. But mind you, when we are talking about minimum student-teacher ratio, we are also adding on more number of teachers in the school. And when we are adding on more number of the teachers in the school, we are enhancing now the expenditure on the school, where the revenue of the school is still under doubt. There is a lot of counter-attacks which we'll have to combat. Why I'm saying we have to combat is because that is not very clearly explained at this moment. As and when the time will unfold, and when more and more research will be done on the draft, and we will get the curriculum framework, we'll be able to understand much more better.
Right.
Because at this moment, we are a little handicapped that we have a draft with us. This draft is now undergoing a lot of amendments, which I believe our recommendations were taken, and we had sent our recommendations. And now a new draft, of course, the revised draft would come in. But what about the curriculum? National curriculum has not come out. That framework we are looking for.
They should have been together. They should have been together. So can I bring in Mr. Sunil Gupta here with the language issue, because all of us are very keen on understanding that what is this conundrum between the mother tongue, the home language, the state language, the regional language, and what are schools' rights and what are the parents' rights on the language matter. So Mr. Gupta,
Seemaji, whenever it be possible,
Ji.
I have a few points that I want to toss across for the panel to ponder over.
Sure.
After
as soon as we finish with the language matter, we'll come back to you, Mr. Pathak. Mr. Gupta, would you like to now speak on the language issue?
Probably touch on this subject, because this subject is going to, in the coming time, it is going to really be a burning issue. And because time and again, it has become fashionable, of course, for people to take a view, particularly on mother tongue. Time and again, it has also occupied the attention of the courts, because it is an issue which has traveled up to the courts time and again. Now, I did hear Dr. Jadhav speak in very laudable terms about the fact that the NEP has actually given a place of honor to the mother tongue. As our previous speaker, Mr. Jagpreet Singh, of course, also was concerned about what he didn't appear to be fully in agreement, and I think for very valid reasons, because you see, with the mother tongue, what we are actually all the time trying to do is that we are trying to, the horse which we are trying to flog is the English language, without saying in so many words. It's a very fashionable or very populist approach which people take. I'm sure there are many experts who advise, they must be having good reasons, that mother tongue is the best language, the language in which the child can develop his or her comprehension to the best level, etc., etc. All that is there. But again, and I am going to be only true to my own salt, and I'm going to speak to you and tell you what the legal philosophy or the constitutional position is, so that instead of each one of us giving our own view and experts giving theirs, etc., etc., what is it? In fact, fortunately for us, there is again as large as a 5-judge bench of the Supreme Court, which has precisely touched on this very issue. The distressing part is that the National Education Policy 2020 takes a full view on this subject without batting an eyelid at what is that view, what are those principles. In short, I'm going to just show to you and demonstrate to you how, once again, it completely not only deviates, it is again completely flouting the basic values and principles which the Supreme Court has laid down for us on the language and mother tongue issue. Just kindly have that, the comparison on language. I'm going by the words of the court so that lawyers paraphrasing and glossing is not actually something I'm accused of. Now, please see here, this is as recent as 2014, and I'm going to read out some very basic extracts from a judgment of the Supreme Court of the Constitution Bench, which is State of Karnataka versus Associated Management of English Medium Primary and Secondary Schools. And I'm going to compare this with the policy that we are all just now having in hand. If you can just scroll down a minute, and I'll just give you a little background, 1 or 2 lines only. The state of Karnataka, like all others, believed that the mother tongue is the best language, in which, whether it's a majority institution or a minority institution, they should conduct their medium of instruction should be only mother tongue and not English, So the English medium schools had a problem. They went to the High Court and then to the Supreme Court. And I'm going to read to you the lines which you will compare directly with the paragraph on the right, which is from the policy. Now, paragraph 33 of that one says that this is a response to those who say that mother tongue is the best and the most comfortable language for the child. And they have been told, mother tongue in the context of the Constitution would mean the language of the linguistic minority in a state, as opposed to majority. There's never a mother tongue concept for the majority, mind you. So mother tongue is a concept known to law or the Constitution only with respect to or in relation to the linguistic minority in a state. And it is the parent or the guardian of the child who will decide what the mother tongue of child is, not the state. So the Constitution nowhere provides that mother tongue is the language which the child is comfortable with. So state is not supposed to boss over and dictate and tell the child's parents or the child that this is the best language, the mother tongue, that you must be taken up in this language in the school. Just kindly scroll down, Madam Malik. Now, as to the right of the parent and the child, para 40, the right to freedom of speech and expression under Article 19(1)(a) of the Constitution includes the freedom of a child to be educated at the primary stage of school in a language of the choice of the child, and the state cannot impose controls on such choice. Just because it thinks that it will be more beneficial for the child if he is taught in the primary stage of school in his mother tongue. How much more clear can the Supreme Court be? This is the law laid down under the Constitution. And we have a policy absolutely at loggerheads with this principle. Then at the final 51, the word occupation, this is the school's right. The school's right. The word occupation in Article 19(1)(g) of the Constitution would mean that the right to establish and administer an educational institution will include the right of a citizen to establish a school for imparting education in a medium of instruction of his choice. That means of the choice of the school manager, the founder of the school. So it's not anybody's business or the state's business to tell the school which should be your medium of instruction. There can be, like for instance, we have a famous school in Delhi. There can be a Gujarati school which can decide not even English. It may decide that Hindi will be the medium of instruction up to class 5. There is a school, Sardar Patel. We all deeply regard and respect that school. And lastly, 58. Though the experts may be uniform in their opinion that children can learn better if they are taught in their mother tongue, the state cannot stipulate as a condition for recognition that the medium of instruction for children would be the mother tongue of the children. So experts apart. Now please see how the policy actually has not even gone near any legal principle or not consulted any expert on law that how we should deal with this issue. The subject is dealt with as multilingualism and the power of language. And then 4.11, it is well understood by whom? By experts. It is well understood that young children learn and grasp non-trivial concepts more quickly in their home language or mother tongue. The state is telling us. Home language is usually the same language as the mother tongue or that which is spoken by local communities. However, at times in multilingual families, there can be a home language spoken by other family members, which may sometimes be different from mother tongue or local language. This is complete, I'm so sorry to say, this is complete khichdi. It's a potpourri. It does not guide anybody into any direction. This is unnecessary meddling by the state with a matter which is completely in the private domain of the citizens and the schools. Please continue. This is how we will actually go hocus pocus completely and haywire. Wherever possible.
Mr.
Now,
Gupta, can I ask you a question, if you permit me, please?
yes.
Yes, go on.
Sir,
Can
is
I-
it possible,
can I
Malik? Is the question
Yes,
permitted?
you could ask. Yes, please
Can
go
I
ahead.
just complete this, please, first? Just 2 more paragraphs.
You just
Yes,
finish it.
sure, sure, sir.
Wherever possible, the medium of instruction will be, it's not saying maybe, it will be the home language or mother tongue or local language or regional language. Now, none of this is English. And we are living in the global world today, and we are wanting all of us to be part of the global citizenry. And English is somehow supposed to be taboo, not to be spoken of. And confusion writ large on the face of these paragraphs, confusion writ large. Thereafter, home local language shall continue to be taught as a language wherever possible. This will be followed by both public and private schools. So they are dominating public and private schools with their own philosophy. In cases where home language, mother tongue textbook material is not available, the language of transaction between teachers and students will still remain the home language and mother tongue wherever possible. All very fashionable, but not practicable. The 3-language formula will continue to be implemented to promote multilingualism as well as promote national unity. However, no language will be imposed on any state. Of course, this is for which part of the country this paragraph is catering to, and this is only for the purposes of telling that a particular language of the north will not be imposed on the south. So this is the substance of this paragraph. And lastly, all efforts will be made. Now please see what a disgrace. All efforts will be made in preparing high quality bilingual textbooks and teaching learning materials for science and mathematics, so that students are enabled to think and speak about the 2 subjects, both in their home language, mother tongue, and in English. So without having first learnt English as a literary language, students are expected to think and speak on mathematics and science in language called English. So you don't allow them to cultivate English as a literary language. You don't even want to mention that anywhere in your priorities. You want only mathematics and science. Suddenly they should become absolutely well-versed to think and speak in English. This is the hypocrisy.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Gupta. That very much answers all the questions that...
This is the hypocrisy of this policy when it comes to language and comes to autonomy.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gupta, for this very wonderful illustration through a legal point of view. So could I now ask Dr. Mohan Reddy, that as in the beginning also Mr. Sushil Salwan had said, and Dr. Jadhav said later, Mr. Om Pathak also reiterated, that the kind of skill gap that we have in our country, the products which are being churned out by educational institutions, and those who finally go for livelihood and industry business management, how do you cater to that lack of skill gap, which you find finally ending up in employment with so much of unemployability of these graduates and the postgraduates?
Thank you, Mrs. Malik. Before I get to answer your question, I should confess that neither am I expert in autonomy or in language. Pardon me on that part of it. But moving on to a couple of comments that Dr. Jadhav made, and especially I know he is a great proponent of the socio-economic justice. Sir, I want to bring to your attention that technology at this point of time will believe me, will bring democratization of learning. That's what we are seeing in a big way all around the world. And we're pushing that too very intensely in our country itself. Because our belief is, people from technology perspective, we run education institutions, that it's no longer between teacher and the students, not unidirectional mode of learning. As rightly pointed out by one of the speakers, 20% only happens in the class, 80% happens outside the class. But now we believe it's probably the same using a network model of learning. I keep saying my grandchildren learn the same thing as my driver's children do at this point of time. There's no denying. You can always challenge me saying that, you need to have that network, you need to have the device. Those are the two key things, which I think we need to work very hard at it. So one thing that I wanted to point out first was democratization of learning is happening because of technology. The second point I wanted to emphasize was, I think Dr. Jadhav also mentioned, saying that Industry 4.0 was not mentioned in the NEP 2020. So that is actually a little more of detail. There is an enormous amount of work being done on the Industry 4.0. It so happened that I chaired a committee on behalf of AICT, or Ministry of Education, on perspective plan for technical education, later part of 2018, early part of 2019. It's all being implemented. To just give you a data point, 150,000 teachers in technical education are being trained at this point of time by AICT teaching institutions. So therefore, there's a lot of intervention happening on that front. Now, coming back to what Mrs. Malik talked about, saying that where is the vocational education at this point of time? Certainly, yes, there's a big gap that we see. I think we mentally, we had a major block in saying that knowledge and skills are two silos. They compartmentalize completely. So knowledge would come through education, skill would come through training. That is not true at all, especially in the world that we live, where we want to get into experiential learning at this point of time. Unless you have the ability to build, this knowledge doesn't become any use. You have to have the knowledge to build, or you can build provided you have the knowledge. So I think the government is doing very well in bringing vocational education as a part of the mainstream with NEP 2020 at this point of time, saying that 50% of the children will get into vocational education. I think there are a number of initiatives that are going on. For example, apprenticeship schemes at this point of time, internships that are happening. Then, we're bringing students into project mode into education institutions. I think in interventions of this nature. And the other one is that we also had yet another silo. The industry was on its own and education is on its own. The connectivity is very poor. The industry-academia linkage, as it's called. So the result is research gets done for research's sake, not keeping in mind what's required by the society, what's required by the industry. That interface, if it improves, now we're talking about exchange of faculty. There's a debate that's going on in terms of bringing industry professionals into education institutions. I think there are a number of interventions that will ensure that we will have people who will start now thinking about a problem, identifying a problem, solving a problem, finding a solution to that problem is what will happen when you start saying, no, these are not segregated stuff. Knowledge and skills have to be joining hands with each other.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reddy, for this wonderful perspective. Could I also here ask Dr. Monga that since a lot of international universities are supposed to be on the annual, if you go by the NEP 2020, and most of the IB and IGCSE students are heading towards foreign universities, foreign shores. So do you think that the international curriculum schools will suffer a setback by that?
By the NEP?
By the NEP? If we get some reputed universities, not, you don't have to go there, they come and set up their campuses here, though we do not know how and when and where, because there are a lot of regulatory bodies. But do you think that the kind of curriculum that the international schools follow in the country, are they going to have some kind of setback because of this?
Well, I'm not very sure about that, because you see, these private universities are allowed to do what they want to. For example, even Christ, Ashoka University, they have mostly IB kids and A-level kids, and they're also getting kids from overseas. Now there's another college which has been opened by the same people called Plaza, and there's already, their seats are full. So I think keeping the cost structure of the international schools, parents are looking into the Indian colleges, and slowly I think more will come in. But even the Indians who are opening colleges for the international students, there's different rulings for private colleges and for government colleges.
So Dr. Dipali Singhi, the same question goes to you on the basis, because you are heading a college in Calcutta. So do you think that when these international universities set up their campuses here, are the Indian colleges and universities going to suffer? Or will there be an exodus towards those colleges and universities because they'll be more affordable? Then you will not have to travel and you will not have to live abroad, but you will be taking international education within our own country. Dr. Dipari?
First of all, students are not traveling abroad for just the education part of it. It's also the experience they would like to gain on large and well-established universities. And we've been talking a lot about on the higher education NEP. That's the policy that's probably going to come in. What we are missing out is that most of the points that we've been raising already exist, whether it is the languages, whether it is the mother tongue. We've just been going back forth on issues where we've been teaching certain language and then we are again going back to English. And again, we are realizing and we are going back to a certain mistake that we've already committed in the past. In the same context, if we are talking about private universities like Christ and Ashoka, they are not foreign universities. They are private universities set up here in the country, which offers something which is very different from the traditional universities which have been there for years. That is why the students are flocking to these universities, which are more liberal in their approaches, especially with their curriculum. Foreign universities coming to India, definitely they will have the space and the competition will grow stronger. But as I mentioned earlier, I would like to point out, would the foreign universities like to come here with the lack of autonomy, with the regulations in place, with the infrastructure not being possible, with politicization of the institutes of higher learning? Do you really think foreign universities would like to come in such a scenario? And if they do, believe me, there would be takers. That's what I personally feel.
I'm sure that they're strangulated. I mean,
yes, they would be.
More levels of regulatory bodies. Yeah.
I'm completely in agreement with Mr. Gupta. There are certain issues that he's raised which are very, very pertinent and we should look into it. And currently what's going on with the private unaided institutions, because most of these foreign universities, if they set up shop here in our country, they are going to be of that nature. They are going to be unaided. And if these kind of regulations are implemented, I'm not sure, whether this would help us in the long run.
Mr. Mohan, you wanted to raise some
shall I respond to some of the very interesting points made?
Yes, yes, Dr. Jadhav, please do it in a little bit, in a little while, because I'd like to bring in Mr. Pathak. He had some points to raise, and then we go to Dr. Jakpreet Singh, and after that, you please summarize what you have to say. So, Mr. Pathak, you had some points to raise. Could you please come in?
Yes, a few concerns and a few observations. As a footnote to what Mr. Sunil Gupta said about the language formula, let me also tell you that within the cow belt, where Hindi language has been, the order of the day, even there, the popular demand by the aspirational class is for English.
Yes.
As a result, be it Rajasthan or be it UP, the governments are now promoting English medium schools right from class 1. So it is happening, and I do sometimes think that this whole debate of the language is spurious. What Mr. Sunil Gupta showed and what the Supreme Court had pronounced, leave it to the child to make a choice. I mean, this is what real autonomy is. That's my one observation. Second is what I said earlier, policy 86 or policy 2020. The devil is really in the implementation of the policy.
That's the key.
The governance is the most important thing, and I am extremely apprehensive and fearful if we can put together structures that will deliver. Two, one very major defect that I see in anything that we're doing is we've done it in the case of telecom, and which is what largely defines its growth, is the separation of the policy, regulation, and operations. Unfortunately, These three stand combined together in one body, in all states or wherever. Unless you separate the regulation function from policy and the operations from regulation, I don't really think we can take an objective view of what needs to be done. Next is about the new emerging adversarial relationship between the government and the schools and between the schools and the parent bodies.
Yes.
Now, the only way we can grow and we can perform well is if we build a working collaboration. Quite unfortunately, that's gone missing, and I don't have an answer to this, but I'm tossing it across to the panel to think about as to what is it that we can do to promote collaboration. See, what has happened is in the past 3 or 4 years, it's become fashionable for every state to enact a fee regulation act. No, see, I can't, I mean, we all know it. We may not even mention it. But you know what hampers the kind of money that is demanded? It happened in the case of higher education. They destroyed it. They destroyed some of the possibly good institutions just because there was a fee cap. So the same thing is happening in private schools now. And my worry is that they mustn't be hurt. See, the fact of the matter is that school education, the K-12 education today is like a marketplace. Schools have their price list by way of the fees, and the parents have a number of schools that they can go to, do that shopping, and find out as to where is the best fit, what is it they can afford. So why don't you leave it between the parent and the school? And see, Seemaji, you also run a school. There are a lot of practitioners here who I know so well, and they understand these things. If a school is not good enough, and if a fees is high, then your school will be deserted.
Market forces, Mr.
You
Bhatt,
will
the market forces.
just give me,
Ultimately, market forces should
yeah,
decide
market forces
the
will come.
quality of education.
Yeah,
Could thank you so much, Mr.
No,
Pathak.
I just want a couple of
Yeah, please. Yeah.
minutes. Just that. Second thing that I want to say is that why can't we leave this between, leave it to be sorted out between the parent, the community, the society, and the school? Second is that this policy hasn't spoken about the teacher education or the
Yes.
teacher empowerment in a manner that it should have. Laudatory words will not really deliver anything on the ground. It's an action plan, it is a strategy. That is where I think the policy falls short. And of course, there hasn't been much discussion about the curricular reforms.
Yes.
That's the cutting edge.
Yes.
So that needs assessments, drive learning. That's what the world believes in, and that is true as well. What are we doing about assessments? Assessments need not be a threat. Assessments are like milestones in the journey of learning. Why can we use them as such? So these are the couple of points I thought I will
Thank you so
just
much.
toss it
Thank you so
across.
much, Mr. Pathak. Wonderful points. And from here, I go to finally to Dr. Jakpreet Singh before we come to Dr. Jadhav. Dr. Jakpreet Singh, taking from the book and taking from the NEP from Dr. Jadhav, I have picked up a term, monumental misdiagnosis. And that is regarding the quality of teaching which goes on into the classroom that Mr. Pathak has just mentioned. So the groundbreaking reforms that we actually talk about in cliched way, do you really think that the boarding schools will particularly feel the pinch of this monumental misdiagnosis of the curriculum, the learning, the teaching, and the training? So what is your take on that?
Well, my take would be very absurd, and I reiterate what I said earlier. We are talking about, I've heard all the teachers, I've heard all the parents say, let's take the horse to the water. And every parent says, let's take the horse to the water. I don't believe in this philosophy. I said, create the thirst. The horse will automatically go to the water. We are depriving a child of the right education. We are the framers of the child's future. We are not having any political or apolitical agendas. We are talking about a very important resource of our country. And that is where my heart beats. We as educationists are deliberating today what is good for the child, what we can cater. Whether they are boarding schools or non-boarding schools does not make a difference. A child has an option. When I was listening to Mrs. Monga, and I was listening to even ma'am talking about IB and IGCSE, please understand, nobody has put the child's aspirations. It is the parental aspiration. It is the group, it is the flock mentality. It is more of a peer pressure. The child's aspirations are never seen. We are talking about universities coming to India. We are talking about the global now network reaching to India. I'm asking to those questions who are doing IB, even my school is doing IB, my school is doing IGCSE, but I'm asking, will those parent aspirations send them to the universities which are coming from Birmingham, they're coming from Cornell, they may come from Wharton, come to India, but will they still send them here or send them to America or UK? My question is, whatever we take the diagnostic system today, whether it's NEP or whether the framers of the future of India, my only appeal to them with a joint hand is keep the child in focus. It's very important for us to understand the culture of our country. It's very important to understand the diversity we have in our country. It is important that we have a national curriculum. It's important to have a national code of education, but keeping in mind that the child has a final answer. A child's opinion is very important. I think the last what I would say is, let the buck stop on the child. Let the child be the decision maker.
Very well said. Very well said. Thank you so much, Dr. Jadhav. Would you now like to summarize this entire discussion for us with your very kind words?
I will try. It's a tough job. First of
not
all,
for a pedagogue like you, not for an educationist like you.
I will try to comment on issues which have been raised. First of all, I want to thank all my panelists for brilliant participation, and very, very fundamentally important points were made. And the debate will, of course, continue. Begin with Mr.
Your audio
Sunil
is
Gupta.
not very clear, Dr. Jadhav. The audio is not very clear. We are not able to hear your voice.
Clear?
No, you aren't very audible.
Okay. Okay. All right. Audio zara bagha 1 minute. Audio ka okay, mute ke liye ki gaye? No, it's not on mute.
No. Please go on. I think there's some technical issue here.
No, I started by thanking all my co-panelists. Can you hear me now?
Yes, of course. Yes, sure.
Yeah.
Please go on.
At the outset, I want to thank all my co-panelists for brilliant participation, and have made some fundamentally important points. And it is impossible for me to take care of every point, but I want to respond to some of the points. My response would be as Mr. Sunil Gupta talked about two issues, and I'm not a legal, I don't have any legal acumen. I'm not a lawyer. I'm anything but a lawyer. But
everyone mute the mic, only then can Professor Jadhav be
To switch off the video, then the audio could be better.
I think, yes, the audio is not clear. So if you could switch off the video, that will be better, Dr. Jadhav.
What happened?
We're not
I
able
think
to...
everybody...
No, there's a bandwidth problem with him.
There's a bandwidth issue, I think.
Anyone who's not in the mute should actually mute.
Could you remove the video, Dr. Jadhav? We'll just try to set it up. Dr. Jadhav, could you please go on? Let's see if we can hear you out.
Yeah. Do I have to start all over again?
No, we were able to hear.
Am I being audible?
Intermittently, we were able to hear you.
Okay. All right.
I'm able to hear Dr. Jadhav very clearly. I can hear him very clearly.
Okay.
You can hear.
Yes, sir. Yes.
So please put your mute for everybody else to be able to hear, I think. Is that okay? Okay.
Please carry on.
Mr. Sunil Gupta very eloquently talked about two legal issues. one relating to light but tight regulation and a language formula at a subsequent stage. As far as the first point is concerned, he talked about the TMA Pai judgment of the Supreme Court, 11-judge bench case, which talked about disapproving the education. And I think his main contention, very clearly was that regulation of educational institution, non-regulation is a rule. This is what he insisted, and he maintained that the national education policy is going against the Supreme Court judgment. I think the response to that was already given by Mr. Mohan Reddy, a lawyer, because education is a non-profit institution. And the important point is that the Constitution itself says that education is not for profit. And most importantly, I think we have to go back to when you say that this particular case of TMA Pai goes against this, it clearly shows the Supreme Court is against regulation or control of private institution. At the same time, we have to also take into account the fact that the directives of state policy have clearly stated about the free and compulsory education for all the age group between 6 to 14. I think Mr. Mohan Reddy eloquently explained that the government is giving flexibility as far as the regulation is concerned. Mr. Om Pathak talked about no need for tight regulation, and he spoke from the student's point of view, which is very, very, very appealing. But, you know, on one hand, he was talking about, he argued that the government is out to destroy the private schools, and he questioned, where will our children go? Now, that looks very, very appealing. But at the same time, in the same breath, he talked against the provision in the Right to Education Act, which serves 25% seats for disadvantaged strata of the society. Sir, Pathak sir, if you are talking about where will our children go, I'm asking you from the point of view of all the disadvantage in our country, where will these people go? Where will these students go? And you are talking again, on one hand, you're talking about, you know, where will our children go? And then you are talking against the reservation for disadvantaged section. I think this is the contradiction, and you need to look into that.
I must only
let me
respond, and I will respond to this.
Excuse me, please let me finish now. I did not disturb when you were saying. Then there was a very important point made by Dr. Deepali Singhi about how autonomy is important from the point of view of promoting innovation. Yes, there is just no doubt about it. But what about IIT? Are they not putting in a lot of innovations in the education system? I think it is simplistic to say that regulation is against creating innovations. Innovations can happen in the government setup and it can happen in the private setup. And I think both of them need to coexist and coexist peacefully. I completely agree with the point that was made about the research, the funding being limited, and that point I completely agree. Teachers training, there was a very important point made again and again about the teachers training. Let me say this, that there are a lot of provisions about teachers training, and at the end, I will come back to that when we talk about the misdiagnosis of the learning crisis. But about language issue, now that is where I'm now completely confused. he was talking in terms of the constitution, the case that he referred to, the Karnataka government versus some organization of schools. I understood what he was saying. I'm not a legal mind, but what you say may be entirely correct, but the provisions which are there are somewhat confusing, and clarifying from expert like you is going to be very helpful. Mohan talked the skill gap, and he insisted on the democratization of learning through technology, and I completely agree with that. The brick and mortar is going to be replaced by click and learn kind of model, and that is happening. History and on those lines have education 4.0. I'm grateful to you that you explained how AICTE is taking initiative and in this particular regard. Last year, I wrote a book on that subject. I will be happy to send you a copy about the Industrial Revolution 4.0 and its implication for all sectors, including education. About the skill development, again, I completely agree with you that mainstreaming, vocationalization of education is a major contribution that this policy is making, and that needs to be supported very clearly. Then talking about the foreign institutions coming in, well, I have a lot of personal experience there. As the Vice Chancellor of Pune University, please, most people do not know that at that time, when I was the Vice Chancellor of Pune University, 45% of all foreign students coming to India were coming to Pune University alone, single university, and 45% of the national total was coming. Because, the foreign students coming in and or foreign universities coming in is definitely going to help. It will force, the competition will force the local institutions to put their act together, and the Indian universities will not suffer. And I'm glad that the example of Ashoka University was given, which is one of the finest universities in the country today. I'm a faculty at Ashoka University, and it's one of the best universities. We need not be afraid of the competition. Competition, in fact, will improve the quality. Pathakji also made a number of points, and I agree with some of them. The devil is in the details, you said. I completely agree. But I do not share the apprehensions that you have about it. Then there is about the final point that was made was about monumental misdiagnosis. About these two things and stop. One was two issues. Regulation of private school. I know this panel is loaded in favor of the private schools, and understandably so. But I must also insist that I have to point this out in a balanced manner, that it has been pointed out by experts that when you are talking really about autonomy, the freedom, I'm quoting a major educationist, the freedom, I quote, this freedom of charging fees has been terribly misused to such an extent that it is just impossible to effectively regulate fee levels in private institutions at school or higher level, whatever be the regulating mechanism. So when they are actually talking about light but tight regulation, what they are saying is that we will rely on their own announcement and their disclosures, public disclosures, and we will regulate only when it is necessary. It is giving a lot of freedom. It is not tightening. In fact, looking at the capitation fee and so many other issues, one should be really talking about major important control in the sense of not exploitation of the poor people and the elitism that is there in the private sector. I'm not a leftist by thinking, but you cannot leave entirely to market forces. It is understood, as an economist, I will say, that whenever there is a market failure, there is a need and room for government intervention. Government intervention is justified mainly because private, unfettered working of the markets does not necessarily work at all times. And whenever it doesn't work, government must come in. And that is exactly what I think the new policy is doing. The final point was about the misdiagnosis of the learning crisis. I have stated here that the Kasturirangan report, and I have quoted, it fails to recognize the elephant in the room, namely poor teacher and teacher accountability, with no mention of teacher absenteeism and the low teacher effort as key problem. So these are real issues which have not been addressed, and it has been emphasized in the report that it is not as if paucity of resources alone is responsible for poor quality education. What lies at the core of the poor quality of education is the lack of school and teacher accountability. The regulation, if it is going to improve the accountability of the school, if it is going to improve the accountability of teachers, I think it is going to be fully justified, and I would not champion the cause of unfettered working of private schools at all. So what this policy is doing is something very important. It is a game changer, but the devil is in details. As I said in the very beginning, that the of concrete program of action has not been specified anywhere. That needs to be specified. Now, legal issues, the relevant people, I do not know. But what I would say as an educationist or as a conscientious citizen of this country, that this policy needs to lay out very clearly the concrete program of action to achieve the laudable target that they have set up. You know, they were talking about, somebody was talking about, you know, how the democratization is taking place of because of technology. That may be true, but do you not know that last month, as late as last month, 2 students committed suicide, both of them coming from educationally backward, and they were finest students, the top quality students, and they committed suicide because they did not have the access to online education. So what are we talking about? With the big digital divide, do you think we can just leave it at that? We cannot, and we have to see the social ramification of that. Therefore, government intervention at appropriate places, not only desirable, it is necessary, and I would like to support it wholeheartedly. Now, too much regulation would be bad. I agree. There is a fine line that has to be drawn, but that is where I think the parliament comes into the picture, in the sense that people speak through the parliament, and that should put the right kind of pressure on the bureaucracy and on the government to stay in line and stay on course. And I want to thank you, Seemaji, for conducting this one so well. I'm aware that
the pleasure is all ours. Thank you so much, Dr. Jadhav.
Many points have not been answered. I'm aware of that, but I would urge you once again to take a look at this book more closely and comment on the book and write about it, and let's debate. You know, in one discussion, so national of 130 crore people is not going to be addressed, but you have made a very, very good beginning. Let this debate and dialogue continue, and it will lead to very desirable social outcomes. Thank you very much, and I want to thank Mr. Salvan for having organized such a wonderful debate and discussion. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jadhav. I'm sure that such an important thing as National Education Policy 2020, which is laying down foundation for the next 50 years, cannot be discussed in just one session. So even many days are short of that. So could I now request Mr. Sushil Salwan to close the webinar with his kind words?
Dr. Jadhav and all the dear panelists, I'm so delighted to hear words of wisdom, and I'm sure this country is watching you with a lot of excitement and anxiety also for various reasons. While Dr. Jadhav has supported and propounded a lot of issues pertaining to the new education policy, we all look forward and we are very keenly waiting for the outcome and the implementation, like what Mr. Om Pathak said, that implementation is the major issue. Dr. Jadhav, I must just request on behalf of the private sector. I'm not saying the private schools, I'm not saying the private higher education institutions, but the private sector, that when this policy was being formulated, led by Shri Kasturi Ranga, who's Padma Vibhushan and also the ISRO chief, all the other members were members from various sector of the government. So maybe vice chancellors or maybe people like Mr. KJ Alphonse was there, Manjul Bhargav, professor of mathematics at Princeton University. Everyone was there. They were all part of the committee. The unfortunate part is that the private sector was not represented out here in the deliberations which took place at the threshold, though views were called later on, subsequently, views were called. I wish people like Dr. Mohan Reddy, Mr. Arun Kapoor, or Dr. Jagpreet Singh should have been there, or Anu Monga should have been there, to at least voice some issues which are a matter of concern, and primarily concern is of the child, not the private institutions. No one is, we are not talking about protecting the private institutions. We are saying while maintaining the autonomy of the private institutions, let child be the focus. Dr. Jadhav, just a minute, sorry. So I must just put one question, possibly the last question, to Dr. Mohan Reddy. If he has to delete any part of the NEP, which part would he delete? That's something which Dr. Mohan Reddy can either tell us if he is, or he's. Yes,
no, sorry. We're running out of time, so I'll be very brief. I don't personally see there's anything that requires to be deleted.
Okay, great.
I have not seen anything of that nature.
Okay,
what
great.
I will certainly talk about is that our ability to execute it. Execution is the key thing. There's a lot of detailing that has to go by. We're talking about 2 hours, not enough for debating this. The 200 pages are not enough. Actually, the original report of Kasturi Rangan is 687 pages. I've had a chance to look at it. I've not read it, I should be honest. So therefore, execution is the key thing, is what I would like to emphasize.
So we would like everyone, the government as well as the private sector, to put in their great efforts to see that the new education policy is implemented. The language issues are very mutually and amicably resolved, because this language issue has been there right from 1958 onwards. So it's time this nation has to look forward and also resolve this issue. So Dr. Narendra Jadhav ji, Dr. Mohan Reddy, Mr. Sunil Gupta, Mr. Om Pathak, Dr. Dipali Singhi, Mrs. Anu Monga, and Dr. Jagpreet Singh, thank you so much for being with us. And thank you, Mrs. Seema Malik, for moderating it. On behalf of the Forum for Promotion of Quality Education, as well as Konark Publishers, who are the publishers of the book which has been authored by Dr. Jadhav, I thank all of you profoundly, and thank you so much. And I assure the government as well as the member of parliaments that the private sector is there to support this nation and every child of this nation. That is what we all feel, with some caveats that let them also live. Thank you so much, and have a good day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Salwan. Thank you very much, Mr. Malik.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jadhav. Pleasure seeing you. Thanks, sir.